Imagine being one of the most recognizable faces in the world, accustomed to doors opening without question, red carpets rolling out at your feet, and guards snapping to attention at your mere presence. Now imagine walking up to what should be your rightful place, only to have a uniformed guard look you straight in the eye and say, "I'm sorry, sir, but your name is not on the list." This isn't fiction. This isn't a scene from a drama series. This is the moment when centuries of royal protocol collided with modern consequences. When past actions finally caught up with present privileges, and when the world watched as one of Britain's most controversial royals discovered that even princes can find themselves on the wrong side of a velvet rope. What happened next would send shockwaves through Buckingham Palace, dominate headlines across the globe, and mark a defining moment in the ongoing transformation of the British royal family. This is the true story of the day Prince Andrew learned that some doors, once closed, may never open again. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured grounds of Windsor Castle as Prince Andrew adjusted his navy blazer and checked his watch. It was 10:47 a.m. on what should have been just another routine royal engagement. The Duke of York had received what he believed was his standard invitation to attend the annual Royal Windsor Horse Show, an event where he had been a familiar presence for decades. Andrew walked with the confident stride that had been ingrained in him since childhood. Born into privilege, educated at the finest institutions, and molded by a lifetime of deference from others, he had never questioned his place in the carefully orchestrated world of royal events. The horse show represented more than just an afternoon of equestrian entertainment. It was one of the few remaining public venues where he could still appear as a working member of the royal family. The security arrangements at the event were more elaborate than usual. Additional barriers had been erected around the perimeter, and the number of uniformed officers had doubled since the previous year. Media crews positioned themselves strategically, their long-range lenses already trained on the royal box area. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation, though few could have predicted the drama about to unfold. As Andrew approached the entrance to the royal enclosure, he noticed the increased security presence but thought little of it. After all, security had been steadily increasing at royal events for years. What he didn't realize was that behind closed doors at Buckingham Palace, a series of meetings had taken place over the previous weeks that would fundamentally alter his relationship with the institution he had served his entire life. The conversations had begun quietly in the private offices of senior royal advisors. Phone calls were made between London and Windsor, emails exchanged with carefully coded language, and decisions reached that would ripple through the monarchy for years to come. The Jeffrey Epstein scandal had created an unprecedented crisis for the royal family, and the palace had finally decided that decisive action was necessary. Standing at 6 feet tall with graying hair and the bearing of a former naval officer, Andrew had always cut an imposing figure at royal events. His military service during the Falklands War had earned him genuine respect, and for decades he had been considered one of the more approachable members of the royal family. Children would wave enthusiastically when they spotted him at public events, and he had maintained a reputation for being willing to engage with the public in ways that some of his more reserved relatives avoided. But the man approaching the royal box that morning carried with him the weight of months of negative headlines, legal challenges, and a disastrous television interview that had backfired spectacularly. The BBC Newsnight interview with Emily Maitlis had been intended to clear his name and restore his reputation. Instead, it had amplified questions about his judgment and associations, creating a public relations nightmare that the palace was still struggling to contain. The royal box at the Windsor Horse Show occupied a prime position overlooking the main arena. Constructed with the finest materials and appointed with comfortable seating for distinguished guests, it represented centuries of royal tradition. The Queen herself had attended this event countless times, often accompanied by various family members who would wave to the crowds and present trophies to winning riders. This is the biggest of history. As Andrew drew closer to the entrance, he could see the familiar faces of event staff bustling about their preparations. Some offered polite nods of recognition, though he noticed that the usual warm greetings seemed more subdued than in previous years. The atmosphere felt different somehow, charged with intention that he couldn't quite identify. The guard stationed at the entrance to the royal enclosure was a seasoned professional named Sergeant Williams. A 20-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police's protection unit, Williams had worked countless royal events and prided himself on his attention to detail and unwavering adherence to protocol. He had been briefed extensively about the day's arrangements, including specific instructions regarding access to the royal box. Williams carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen it all. He had worked protection details for foreign dignitaries, managed crowd control at state funerals, and coordinated security for royal weddings watched by millions around the world. His experience had taught him that the most challenging moments often arose not from external threats, but from the complex interpersonal dynamics within the royal family itself. The instructions Williams had received that morning were unprecedented in his career. Never before had he been asked to restrict access for a member of the immediate royal family. The directive had come through official channels bearing the appropriate authorizations and security codes, but it still felt surreal as he prepared to implement it. Prince Andrew reached the checkpoint and offered his characteristic smile, expecting the usual swift acknowledgement and immediate passage. He had walked through this same entrance dozens of times over the years, never once having his presence questioned or his access challenged. The routine was so familiar that he barely registered the security procedures anymore. "Good morning," Andrew said pleasantly to Sergeant Williams, already moving toward the entrance as if his passage was a foregone conclusion. The prince carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never been denied entry anywhere in his life. But instead of the expected respectful nod and step aside, Sergeant Williams remained firmly positioned in front of the entrance. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," he replied formally, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a professional executing difficult orders. "I'll need to check the access list, sir." The request caught Andrew off guard. In all his years of attending royal events, he could not recall a single instance where his name had needed to be verified on any list. The very suggestion seemed absurd. He was, after all, the Queen's second son, a working member of the royal family, and someone who had attended this particular event more times than he could count.
"I'm sorry?"
Andrew asked, his smile faltering slightly as he processed what he had just heard. The question carried a note of disbelief, as if he thought he might have misunderstood the guard's request. Sergeant Williams maintained his professional demeanor while reaching for the official clipboard that contained the day's authorized access list. His movements were deliberate and careful, aware that every gesture was likely being observed and would later be dissected by media analysts and royal watchers around the world. The clipboard contained multiple pages of names, organized alphabetically and cross-referenced with security clearance levels. Williams had reviewed the list multiple times that morning, memorizing the key details and preparing for various contingencies. He knew exactly what he would find when he reached the section where Prince Andrew's name should have appeared. "Your Royal Highness, I need to verify your authorization for access to the royal box today," Williams explained, his tone remaining respectful but firm. The words hung in the air between them, creating a moment of profound awkwardness that neither man had ever experienced in this context. Andrew watched in growing bewilderment as the sergeant methodically reviewed the pages. The prince's expression shifted from mild confusion to visible concern as the seconds ticked by without the expected confirmation of his access. Other guests were beginning to arrive for the event, and he could sense curious glances in their direction. "There seems to be some kind of mistake," Andrew said, his voice carrying a note of authority that he hoped would resolve the situation quickly. "I'm Prince Andrew. I don't believe I've ever needed to be on a list for this event." Sergeant Williams completed his review of the documentation and looked up to meet the prince's gaze directly. The moment had arrived that he had been dreading since receiving his briefing earlier that morning. Years of training and experience had prepared him for many challenging situations, but nothing had quite prepared him for this. "I'm sorry, sir," Williams said clearly, his voice carrying across the immediate area with unmistakable clarity. "Your name is not on the list." The words hit Prince Andrew like a physical blow. For a moment, he stood frozen in place, unable to process what he had just heard. The confident smile disappeared entirely from his face, replaced by an expression of shock and disbelief that would be captured by photographers positioned nearby. The implications of the guard's statement began to sink in immediately. This wasn't a simple administrative error or miscommunication. This was a deliberate exclusion, sanctioned at the highest levels of the royal hierarchy, and delivered in full view of the public and media who had gathered for what should have been a routine royal appearance. Andrew's mind raced through possible explanations. Perhaps there had been a security concern he wasn't aware of. Maybe the guest list had been restricted due to space limitations. He desperately searched for any rational explanation that didn't point to the obvious conclusion that his access had been deliberately revoked. "I think there must be some confusion," Andrew said, his voice rising slightly as the reality of the situation began to penetrate his shock. "Could you perhaps check with someone?" This is clearly an error. But Sergeant Williams had already checked everything he needed to check. His instructions had been crystal clear, and he had the full authority of the palace behind his actions. The decision to exclude Prince Andrew had been made at the highest levels, communicated through proper channels, and implemented with the full knowledge of the consequences it would create. The small crowd of onlookers who had gathered to watch the arrivals began to murmur among themselves as the unusual scene played out before them. Phones were already being raised to capture photos and videos of the unprecedented encounter between the prince and the guard who was barring his entry. In that moment, standing outside the royal box he had entered hundreds of times before, Prince Andrew faced the stark reality that his world had irrevocably changed. The institutional protection he had taken for granted his entire life had been withdrawn, leaving him exposed and vulnerable in a way he had never experienced before. The conversation between the prince and the security guard continued for several more minutes, but the outcome had already been determined. For the first time in his life, Prince Andrew would not be granted access to a royal event, marking the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter in his relationship with the monarchy he had served since birth. The aftermath of Sergeant Williams' declaration sent ripples through the crowd gathered at the Windsor Horse Show. Prince Andrew stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, his mind struggling to process the unprecedented situation unfolding before him. The familiar sounds of the event preparation, horses neighing in the distance, the chatter of arriving guests, the mechanical whir of camera shutters, seemed to fade into background noise as the reality of his exclusion settled in. Behind the prince, a small queue of other distinguished guests had begun to form, their conversations growing increasingly uncomfortable as they witnessed the standoff. Lady Margaret Thornbury, a longtime supporter of equestrian events and friend of the royal family, shifted nervously on her feet while pretending to examine her program. Sir Richard Pemberton, a retired diplomat who had attended the horse show for 15 consecutive years, exchanged meaningful glances with his wife as they recognized the historical significance of what they were witnessing. The media representatives positioned around the royal enclosure had initially assumed they were observing routine security procedures. But as the conversation between the prince and the guard extended beyond normal protocols, experienced royal photographers began to sense that something extraordinary was happening. Telephoto lenses swung in their direction, and reporters started making urgent phone calls to their editors. Sergeant Williams maintained his professional stance, acutely aware that his handling of this moment would be scrutinized for years to come. His 20 years of experience in royal protection had taught him that the most dangerous situations often arose not from external threats, but from the complex interpersonal dynamics within the royal family itself. He had been present during family disagreements at public events, had witnessed private conversations that never made it to the newspapers, and had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of royal protocol with discretion and tact. But nothing in his extensive training had prepared him for the task of denying access to a member of the immediate royal family. The briefing he had received that morning had been conducted by Assistant Commissioner Patricia Henley, one of the most senior officers in the Metropolitan Police's protection unit. Henley had explained the situation with characteristic thoroughness, ensuring that Williams understood both the legal authority behind the decision and the potential consequences of his actions. "The directive comes directly from the private secretary's office," Henley had explained during the briefing. "This isn't a security decision made by law enforcement. This is an administrative action taken by the royal household itself. Your role is simply to implement the instructions you've been given, regardless of any personal feelings about the situation." Williams had nodded his understanding, but privately he had wondered about the broader implications of what he was being asked to do. The exclusion of Prince Andrew represented a fundamental shift in the royal family's approach to managing controversy, moving from quiet private discussions to public demonstrations of institutional consequences. As the standoff continued, Prince Andrew's initial shock began to transform into a mixture of embarrassment and anger. He was acutely aware of the growing attention from other guests and media representatives, and the public nature of his exclusion added layers of humiliation that he had never experienced before. Throughout his life, any disciplinary actions or family disagreements had been handled behind closed doors away from public scrutiny. "I need to speak with someone in authority," Andrew said firmly, his voice carrying the tone of command that he had developed during his military service. "This is clearly a misunderstanding that needs to be resolved immediately." Sergeant Williams reached for his radio, knowing that his superiors were monitoring the situation closely from their command post. The communications center had been established in a temporary trailer positioned discreetly behind the main grandstand, staffed by senior officers who could provide guidance and authorization for unusual circumstances. "Control, this is Williams at Royal Box Alpha." He spoke into his radio with measured calm, requesting supervisor assistance for access verification issue. The response came back within seconds, the voice of Assistant Commissioner Henley crackling through the speaker with unmistakable clarity. "Williams, maintain your position and adhere to the authorized access list. No exceptions or modifications without direct authorization from the private secretary's office." The radio exchange was audible to Prince Andrew and several nearby guests, making it clear that the exclusion was not the result of a lower-level mistake or misunderstanding. The authority behind the decision extended to the highest levels of royal administration, and the instructions were being implemented with full institutional support. Andrew's face flushed with a combination of anger and embarrassment as the implications of the radio message became clear. Not only was he being denied access, but the denial was being conducted with obvious advanced planning and coordination. This wasn't a spontaneous security decision or an administrative oversight. It was a deliberate and calculated exclusion that had been authorized at the highest levels of the royal hierarchy. The small crowd of onlookers continued to grow as word of the unusual situation spread through the event grounds. Other members of the royal family were expected to arrive within the next 30 minutes, and the prospect of their witnessing Andrew's exclusion added another layer of complexity to an already delicate situation. Among the gathering crowd was Emma Richardson, a freelance journalist who had covered royal events for over a decade. Richardson had arrived early to secure a good position for photographing the royal arrivals, but she quickly realized that she was witnessing something far more significant than routine pageantry. She began discreetly taking notes while capturing photos of the ongoing confrontation. "I've never seen anything like this," Richardson would later tell her editor at the Daily Telegraph. "The body language, the extended conversation with security, the radio calls for supervision. Everything about this situation was unprecedented." You could see in the prince's face that he was genuinely shocked by what was happening. Meanwhile, inside the royal box area, event organizers were becoming increasingly aware of the situation developing at their entrance. James Morrison, the show's director, had been managing equestrian events for the royal family for over 15 years. He prided himself on ensuring that everything proceeded smoothly and without controversy. But the current situation was rapidly spiraling beyond his control. Morrison approached the entrance from inside the royal enclosure, hoping to provide some assistance in resolving what he assumed was a routine security issue. But as he drew closer and observed the tense conversation between Prince Andrew and Sergeant Williams, he began to understand that this was far more complex than a simple administrative problem. "Is there anything I can do to help resolve this situation?" Morrison asked diplomatically, directing his question to both the prince and the security officer, while carefully avoiding taking sides in what was clearly a sensitive matter. Sergeant Williams appreciated Morrison's diplomatic approach, but knew that the event organizer had no authority to override the instructions he had received from the royal household. "Mr. Morrison, this is an access authorization issue that needs to be resolved through official channels. I don't have the authority to make exceptions to the approved guest list." Prince Andrew seized on Morrison's intervention as a potential solution to his predicament. "James, surely you can confirm my standing invitation to this event. I've been attending for decades, and there's obviously been some kind of administrative error." Morrison found himself in an extraordinarily uncomfortable position. As the event director, he wanted to accommodate all distinguished guests, especially members of the royal family. But he also recognized that the security protocols were not under his jurisdiction, and any attempt to override official procedures could have serious consequences for his own position. "Your Royal Highness, I would certainly welcome your attendance at the event," Morrison replied carefully, "but the access procedures are managed entirely by the security services. I don't have the authority to override their protocols." The diplomatic response provided no relief for Prince Andrew's situation, and he began to realize that the exclusion was more comprehensive and coordinated than he had initially understood. This wasn't simply a matter of convincing one security guard or appealing to one event organizer. It represented a systematic decision that had been implemented across multiple levels of authority. As the minutes passed, the gathering crowd continued to grow, and the media presence became more prominent. Television crews from major news networks had begun to arrive, having been alerted to the unusual situation by their photographers already on site. The story was beginning to take on a life of its own, with social media posts and news alerts starting to circulate globally. Inside Buckingham Palace, senior staff members were monitoring the situation through live television feeds and reports from their security liaison officers. The private secretary's office had anticipated that the exclusion might generate significant media attention, but the actual implementation was proving to be even more dramatic than they had expected. Sir Edward Young, the Queen's private secretary, watched the developing situation from his office while maintaining regular communication with other senior royal officials. The decision to exclude Prince Andrew had been made after extensive consultation with legal advisors, public relations experts, and other members of the royal family. It represented a calculated risk designed to demonstrate that the monarchy was taking decisive action to address the ongoing controversy surrounding the prince. The institution must be protected, Young had argued during the planning discussions. Individual members of the family cannot be allowed to compromise the reputation and stability of the crown, regardless of their position in the line of succession. Back at Windsor, Prince Andrew was coming to terms with the reality that his exclusion was not going to be reversed through appeals or explanations. The security protocols were being implemented with unwavering consistency, and no amount of personal history or royal status was going to change the current situation. The prince looked around at the growing crowd of observers, many of whom were now openly watching the unprecedented spectacle. Camera phones were being raised throughout the area, and he could see news crews positioning themselves for better angles on the developing story. The public nature of his humiliation was complete, and there was no way to retreat gracefully from the situation. For a man who had spent his entire life as the center of attention at royal events, being denied entry represented more than just a practical inconvenience. It was a symbolic rejection of his role within the family and the institution he had served since birth. The exclusion carried implications that extended far beyond a single horse show, suggesting a fundamental change in his relationship with the monarchy itself. As Prince Andrew finally began to accept that he would not be gaining access to the royal box, he faced the difficult decision of how to exit the situation with whatever dignity remained available to him. The eyes of the world were now watching his response to this unprecedented public rejection, and his next actions would be analyzed and debated for years to come. The weight of public scrutiny pressed down on Prince Andrew as he stood frozen in the uncomfortable limbo between expectation and reality. The familiar world he had navigated with confidence for 6 decades seemed to shift beneath his feet as the true scope of his isolation became apparent. What had begun as a routine arrival at a family event had transformed into a defining moment that would reshape not only his own future, but the monarchy's approach to accountability and consequence. Sergeant Williams maintained his position with professional stoicism, but internally he grappled with the historical significance of his role in this unprecedented encounter. His radio crackled periodically with updates from the command center, where senior officials monitored every development through multiple camera feeds and real-time reports. The Metropolitan Police had coordinated security for countless royal events, but never before had they been required to implement such a dramatic exclusion of a family member. The crowd of observers continued to expand as news of the confrontation spread throughout the event grounds. Smartphones captured every moment from multiple angles, ensuring that no detail of the prince's humiliation would escape documentation. Social media platforms began buzzing with initial reports and blurry photographs, while established news organizations mobilized their resources to provide comprehensive coverage of the breaking story. Among the gathering spectators was Dr. Era Mitchell, a constitutional historian from Oxford University who had attended the horse show as a guest of the event organizers. Mitchell recognized immediately that she was witnessing a moment of profound historical significance, one that would likely be studied and analyzed for decades to come. She began making detailed notes about the interaction, understanding that first-hand accounts of such moments often proved invaluable for future researchers. The body language spoke volumes. Mitchell would later write in her analysis of the incident. Prince Andrew's posture shifted from confident expectation to bewildered shock, then to visible anger, and finally to defeated acceptance. It was a physical manifestation of a man coming to terms with the complete reversal of his lifelong assumptions about power and privilege. The prolonged standoff began to attract attention from other members of the Royal Protection Unit stationed throughout the event grounds. These officers faced the delicate challenge of maintaining security protocols while managing an increasingly volatile situation that threatened to escalate beyond their ability to control. Their primary concern was ensuring that the confrontation didn't create broader security risks or provide opportunities for hostile elements to exploit the chaos. Chief Inspector David Hartwell approached from the perimeter, his experience in managing complex security situations evident in his careful assessment of the developing crisis. Hartwell had coordinated protection for the royal family during some of their most challenging public appearances, including events where family tensions or public controversies had created additional complications. "Sergeant Williams," Hartwell said quietly as he joined the group, "what's the current status of the situation?" "The access list has been verified multiple times, sir," Williams replied with professional precision. "The instructions from the private secretary's office are clear and unambiguous. No modifications or exceptions have been authorized." Hartwell nodded his understanding while discreetly observing Prince Andrew's increasingly agitated demeanor. The chief inspector's primary concern was preventing the situation from escalating into a more dramatic confrontation that could compromise security protocols or create additional public relations challenges for the royal family. Meanwhile, the event's media coordinator, Jennifer Walsh, found herself managing an unexpected crisis that threatened to overshadow the actual horse show entirely. Walsh had worked with major news organizations for over a decade, but she had never faced a situation where the story itself was unfolding at the event she was supposed to be promoting. "We're getting calls from news desks around the world," Walsh told her assistant over her mobile phone while watching the confrontation from a discreet distance. "This isn't just a UK story anymore. International outlets are picking it up, and they're all asking for official statements about what's happening." The global media response was indeed rapid and comprehensive. News organizations that had initially planned routine coverage of a traditional royal event suddenly found themselves witnessing an unprecedented breakdown in royal protocol. Editorial teams scrambled to provide context about Prince Andrew's recent controversies, while their reporters and photographers captured every moment of his public exclusion. BBC News interrupted regular programming to provide live coverage of the developing story, with royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell offering real-time analysis of the situation's broader implications. "What we're seeing here represents a fundamental shift in how the royal family manages internal controversies," Witchell explained to viewers worldwide. "Never before have we witnessed such a public demonstration of institutional consequences for a senior member of the family." Inside the temporary command center established for the event, Assistant Commissioner Patricia Henley coordinated with multiple agencies while monitoring live feeds from security cameras positioned throughout the venue. Henley had anticipated that implementing the exclusion order would generate significant attention, but the actual media response was exceeding even her most pessimistic projections. "We need to maintain our positions and continue following established protocols," Henley instructed her team through the communications system. "Any deviation from the authorized procedures could compromise the legal authority behind our actions and create additional complications for everyone involved." Back at the entrance to the royal box, Prince Andrew was beginning to comprehend that his exclusion represented more than a temporary administrative problem. The coordination evident in the security response, the involvement of senior officials, and the systematic nature of the denial all pointed to a deliberate decision made at the highest levels of royal authority. The realization that his own family had orchestrated his public humiliation hit him with devastating force. This wasn't simply about access to a horse show. It was a demonstration of institutional power designed to send a clear message about accountability and consequences. The monarchy was publicly distancing itself from him in the most dramatic way possible, using his exclusion as a symbolic statement about its commitment to addressing the controversies that had surrounded him. "I need to make some phone calls," Andrew said finally, his voice carrying a tone of resignation mixed with barely controlled anger. The statement was directed as much to himself as to anyone else, representing his acknowledgement that the situation required intervention from sources beyond those immediately present. Sergeant Williams nodded respectfully, understanding that the prince was beginning to accept the reality of his exclusion while seeking alternative approaches to address his predicament. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. You're welcome to use any of the public areas for your communications." The suggestion that he should retreat to public areas rather than being provided with private facilities normally reserved for distinguished guests represented another layer of his diminished status. Throughout his life, Prince Andrew had taken for granted the special accommodations and exclusive access that came with his royal position. Now he was being directed to the same facilities available to ordinary members of the public. As Andrew stepped away from the immediate confrontation to make his phone calls, the crowd of observers began to disperse slightly, though many remained positioned to witness whatever developments might follow. The initial shock of seeing a royal family member denied access was giving way to speculation about the broader implications of such an unprecedented action. The phone calls Prince Andrew made over the next 20 minutes would later be described by palace sources as increasingly desperate attempts to find someone with the authority and willingness to reverse the exclusion order. He contacted members of his immediate staff, longtime friends within the royal household, and even attempted to reach other family members who might intervene on his behalf. But each conversation yielded the same result: expressions of sympathy accompanied by explanations of powerlessness. The exclusion had been authorized at such a high level within the royal hierarchy that overturning it would require intervention from the Queen herself, and early indications suggested that such intervention was unlikely to be forthcoming. Sir Timothy Lawrence, Princess Anne's husband and a respected figure within the royal family, received one of Andrew's calls while preparing for his own arrival at the event. Lawrence had maintained friendly relations with Andrew over the years, but he found himself in an impossible position when asked to intervene in what was clearly a carefully orchestrated institutional decision. "Andrew, I sympathize with your situation, but this is far beyond anything I can influence," Lawrence explained diplomatically. The decision to implement these protocols came from the very top of the household organization. Any attempt to override them would require authorization that simply isn't available through normal channels. The conversation with Lawrence, like the others Andrew attempted, reinforced the reality that his exclusion had been planned and implemented with comprehensive coordination across all levels of the royal organization. There would be no last-minute reprieve, no face-saving compromise, and no quiet resolution that would allow him to salvage his dignity from the situation. As news of the confrontation continued to spread, other members of the royal family scheduled to attend the event faced difficult decisions about their own participation. The presence of Prince Charles, Princess Anne, and other senior royals at the same event where Andrew had been excluded would inevitably generate additional media attention and questions about family unity in the face of controversy. The communications team at Buckingham Palace worked frantically to coordinate responses to the flood of media inquiries that were pouring in from around the world. Every major news organization wanted official statements about the exclusion, explanations of the decision-making process, and predictions about the long-term implications for Prince Andrew's role within the royal family. But the palace's response remained consistent across all inquiries. "We do not comment on security arrangements or private family matters." The standard deflection, while legally appropriate, did little to satisfy the global appetite for information about what was clearly a story of immense public interest. International reaction began to develop as foreign news organizations provided their own analysis of the situation. European royalty correspondents offered comparisons to similar controversies in other monarchies, while American networks focused on the connections to ongoing legal proceedings and investigations that had contributed to Prince Andrew's current predicament. The Spanish newspaper El País published an editorial describing the exclusion as a necessary demonstration of institutional integrity in the face of personal misconduct. The German publication Der Spiegel offered a more cynical interpretation, suggesting that the British monarchy is engaging in public theater designed to distract from broader questions about accountability and transparency. As the afternoon progressed and Prince Andrew's efforts to reverse his exclusion proved fruitless, he was forced to confront the reality that he would not be participating in the Royal Windsor Horse Show. The symbolic significance of his absence from such a traditional family event would resonate far beyond the immediate humiliation of being denied entry. The prince's exclusion represented a fundamental shift in his relationship with the institution he had served his entire life. No longer would he be able to assume automatic access to royal events, or take for granted the privileges that had defined his existence since birth. The careful choreography of royal protocol had been disrupted in the most public way possible, sending shockwaves through centuries of established tradition and precedent. The aftermath of Prince Andrew's failed phone calls marked a turning point in the day's events, as the reality of his complete institutional isolation became undeniably clear. Standing in the public area of the Windsor Horse Show grounds, surrounded by curious onlookers and persistent photographers, he experienced a level of vulnerability that was entirely foreign to his privileged existence. The protective bubble that had surrounded him since birth had burst in the most public and humiliating manner possible. The international media response continued to intensify as news organizations around the world recognized the historic nature of what was unfolding. CNN dispatched additional correspondents to Windsor, while the BBC expanded its coverage to include expert panels analyzing the constitutional and personal implications of the royal exclusion. Social media platforms buzzed with commentary, speculation, and increasingly viral videos captured by event attendees who had witnessed the confrontation firsthand. Dr. Robert Lacey, the renowned royal biographer, received an urgent call from his publisher requesting immediate commentary on the developing situation. Lacey had spent decades studying the internal dynamics of the British royal family, but even his extensive experience had not prepared him for such a dramatic public breakdown in family unity. This represents the most significant public humiliation of a senior royal family member in modern history, Lacey would later write in his emergency analysis piece. The decision to exclude Prince Andrew in such a visible manner suggests that the monarchy is willing to sacrifice individual members to preserve institutional credibility. It's a calculated gamble that could either strengthen or severely damage the crown's reputation. Meanwhile, inside the royal box area that Prince Andrew had been denied access to, preparations continued for the arrival of other family members. Events staff worked with nervous efficiency, acutely aware that every aspect of their service would be scrutinized, given the day's unprecedented events. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation about how the remaining royals would handle their attendance in light of Andrew's exclusion. Princess Anne, known for her pragmatic approach to royal duties and her ability to navigate controversial situations with dignified composure, arrived at the venue precisely on schedule. Her experienced protection team had briefed her about the ongoing situation with Prince Andrew, but she maintained her characteristic focus on the scheduled event rather than the surrounding drama. As Anne approached the same entrance where her brother had been denied access just hours earlier, the contrast in treatment became starkly apparent. Sergeant Williams, still maintaining his post with professional diligence, immediately recognized the Princess Royal and stepped aside with a respectful bow. The efficiency and warmth of her reception highlighted the deliberate nature of Andrew's exclusion while demonstrating that security protocols remain normal for other family members. "Good afternoon, Your Royal Highness," Williams said formally, his tone carrying none of the tension that had marked his earlier interaction with Prince Andrew. "Everything is prepared for your arrival." Princess Anne acknowledged the greeting with a brief nod while observing the heightened media presence surrounding the royal enclosure. Her experienced eye quickly assessed the situation, recognizing the signs of a major royal story in development. She had navigated countless media storms throughout her decades of public service, but the current atmosphere felt particularly charged with potential consequences. Inside the royal box, Anne took her designated seat and began reviewing her program for the afternoon's events, projecting an image of calm normalcy despite the chaos surrounding her brother's exclusion. Her presence served as a powerful statement about institutional continuity, demonstrating that the monarchy would continue its traditional functions regardless of individual controversies. The television coverage of Princess Anne's smooth arrival provided a stark contrast to the earlier footage of Prince Andrew's confrontation with security. News analysts immediately seized upon the comparison, using it to illustrate the selective nature of the exclusion and the calculated precision with which it had been implemented. "The royal family is sending a very clear message," explained constitutional expert Professor Vernon Bogdanor during a live BBC interview. "They are demonstrating that institutional loyalty in public service will be rewarded with continued access and privilege, while those who compromise the monarchy's reputation will face real consequences." Princess Anne's normal reception versus Prince Andrew's exclusion couldn't be more symbolic. Back in the public areas of the event grounds, Prince Andrew continued to grapple with the unprecedented situation. The failure of his phone calls to generate any relief had forced him to confront the reality that his exclusion was not temporary or reversible through normal diplomatic channels. The comprehensive nature of the institutional decision against him suggested planning and coordination that extended far beyond a simple security protocol adjustment. The prince's longtime personal protection officer, Detective Inspector Michael Reynolds, found himself in an extraordinarily difficult position as he observed his principal's humiliation. Reynolds had served with Andrew for over 8 years, developing both professional respect and personal loyalty for the man he was charged with protecting. But the current situation placed him in direct conflict between his duty to the individual and his obligation to the institution. "Sir, perhaps it would be best if we return to your residence," Reynolds suggested diplomatically, recognizing that prolonged exposure to media scrutiny would only compound the damage to Andrew's reputation and dignity. This situation doesn't appear to be resolving itself favorably. The suggestion that he should retreat from a royal event represented another profound blow to Prince Andrew's sense of identity and status. Throughout his life, he had been the one arriving at events while others departed, the one whose presence elevated occasions rather than compromising them. The role reversal was psychologically devastating for someone whose entire self-concept had been built around privilege and precedence. "I'm not running away from this," Andrew replied with a mixture of defiance and desperation. "There has to be some way to address this situation appropriately. I can't simply accept being excluded from my own family's events without some form of explanation or recourse." But Reynolds, drawing on his years of experience in royal protection, understood that sometimes strategic withdrawal was the most dignified option available. "Sir, with respect, continuing to remain in public view under these circumstances may create additional challenges. The media attention is only going to intensify, and prolonged exposure could complicate any future efforts to address the situation." The wisdom of Reynolds' advice became increasingly apparent as more news crews arrived at the venue, and the crowd of curious onlookers continued to grow. Amateur photographers and video journalists were capturing every moment of Andrew's continued presence, ensuring that his humiliation would be documented from every possible angle and distributed across global media platforms. Social media analysis of the developing story revealed the viral nature of the content being generated. Hashtags like #RoyalExclusion and #PrinceAndrewDied began trending worldwide, while memes and commentary spread rapidly across Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. The younger generation's engagement with the story through digital platforms ensured that the humiliation would reach audiences far beyond traditional news consumers. Inside Buckingham Palace, the Queen's private apartments remained notably quiet as Her Majesty received regular briefings about the developing situation at Windsor. Palace sources later described her response as deeply saddened but resolute, suggesting that while the Queen regretted the personal pain being inflicted on her son, she supported the institutional decision to exclude him from royal events. The Queen's position represented perhaps the most complex aspect of the entire controversy. As both Andrew's mother and the head of the institution implementing his punishment, she found herself torn between maternal instincts and constitutional responsibilities. Her silence throughout the day spoke volumes about the difficult balance she was attempting to maintain. Sir Edward Young, continuing to coordinate the palace response from his office, received regular updates about media reaction and public opinion polling related to the exclusion. Early indicators suggested that public sentiment was largely supportive of the decision to distance the royal family from Prince Andrew, though there were expressions of sympathy for the personal humiliation he was experiencing. The polling numbers are actually quite encouraging, Young reported to other senior palace officials during an emergency conference call. The public appears to appreciate that the institution is taking decisive action to address the controversy. The exclusion is being viewed as appropriate accountability rather than excessive punishment. As the afternoon progressed, Prince Andrew was forced to make the painful decision to leave the Windsor Horse Show grounds without having participated in any of the scheduled events. The sight of him walking away from a royal function represented a symbolic moment that would be remembered as a defining image of his fall from grace within the family hierarchy. The departure was captured by dozens of photographers and videographers, creating images that would appear on front pages and television screens around the world. Andrew's expression during the walk to his vehicle revealed a mixture of anger, sadness, and resignation that spoke to the emotional toll of his public rejection by the institution he had served his entire life. Detective Inspector Reynolds coordinated with the local police to ensure a secure route for Andrew's departure, but there was no hiding the reality that this was a retreat rather than a normal conclusion to a royal engagement. The usual protocols for royal departures, coordinated timing, ceremonial elements, and public acknowledgments, were replaced by a hurried exit designed to minimize further exposure to media scrutiny. As Prince Andrew's vehicle departed the Windsor Horse Show grounds, he left behind not only a single missed event, but also the remnants of his former life as a working member of the royal family. The exclusion had demonstrated that his relationship with the monarchy had fundamentally changed, possibly permanently, and that his future role within the institution remained uncertain at best. The reverberations of the day's events would continue for months and years to come, influencing royal protocol, media coverage of the family, and public perceptions of accountability within the monarchy. But in that moment, as Andrew's car disappeared from view, the immediate chapter of his unprecedented public humiliation came to a close, leaving behind a transformed understanding of power, privilege, and consequence within the British royal establishment. The Royal Windsor Horse Show continued as scheduled, with Princess Anne and other family members fulfilling their traditional roles while the absent prince became the dominant story of the day. The contrast between normal royal function and dramatic exclusion created a powerful narrative about institutional resilience in the face of individual controversy, setting the stage for ongoing debates about the monarchy's future direction and accountability mechanisms. The weeks following Prince Andrew's exclusion from the Royal Windsor Horse Show marked the beginning of a profound transformation in both his personal circumstances and the broader royal family's approach to managing internal controversies. The dramatic images of his public rejection had circulated globally, creating an indelible record of accountability that would influence royal protocol for generations to come. Inside his private residence at the Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, Prince Andrew struggled to come to terms with the new reality of his diminished status within the family hierarchy. The sprawling 30-room mansion, which had once served as a symbol of his elevated position within the royal establishment, now felt more like a gilded prison where he could contemplate the full extent of his fall from grace. The prince spent long hours in his private study, a room lined with photographs documenting decades of royal engagements, military service, and family celebrations. These images, which had once represented cherished memories of a life of privilege and purpose, now served as painful reminders of everything he had lost through his association with controversial figures and his subsequent handling of the resulting scandal. His staff, many of whom had served him loyally for years, found themselves navigating an increasingly difficult professional situation. The exclusion from the horse show had been followed by additional restrictions on Andrew's participation in royal events, creating uncertainty about their own job security and future prospects within the royal household. Amanda Thirsk, who had served as Andrew's private secretary during some of his most challenging years, submitted her resignation just 2 weeks after the Windsor incident. Her departure letter, portions of which were later leaked to the media, provided insight into the impossible position faced by those closest to the prince during his institutional isolation. The events of recent months have placed me in a position where I can no longer effectively serve His Royal Highness's interests while maintaining my professional integrity, Thirsk wrote in her carefully worded resignation. The institutional constraints now governing the Duke's activities have fundamentally altered the nature of the role, making it impossible to pursue the constructive outcomes we all desire. The resignation of his most trusted advisor deepened Prince Andrew's sense of abandonment and highlighted the systematic nature of his isolation from the royal establishment. Staff departures, cancelled engagements, and reduced official communications combined to create a comprehensive exclusion that extended far beyond the single dramatic incident at Windsor. Meanwhile, at Buckingham Palace, the Queen grappled with the personal and constitutional implications of the decision to exclude her second son from family events. Palace sources described her state of mind during this period as profoundly conflicted, torn between maternal love and institutional responsibility, in ways that had never been tested so publicly before. The Queen's weekly audiences with Prime Minister Boris Johnson during this period reportedly included extensive discussions about the royal family's handling of the Andrew controversy and its potential impact on the monarchy's relationship with Parliament and the public. Johnson, while supportive of the palace's decisive action, expressed concerns about the long-term implications of such public family divisions. Her Majesty is handling an extraordinarily difficult situation, with characteristic dignity and wisdom, Johnson told his senior advisors after one particularly lengthy audience. But there's no denying that this controversy has created challenges for the monarchy that extend far beyond any individual family member. Constitutional experts began analyzing the precedent set by Prince Andrew's exclusion, debating whether it represented a necessary evolution in royal accountability or a dangerous departure from traditional family unity. Professor Robert Hazel of University College London published a comprehensive analysis of the situation that became required reading for students of constitutional law. The exclusion of Prince Andrew marks a watershed moment in the modern monarchy's development, Hazel wrote in his influential paper. For the first time, we have witnessed the institution prioritizing its public reputation and constitutional role over the personal interests of a senior family member. This represents a fundamental shift from historical patterns of royal behavior. The international community also took notice of the dramatic changes within the British royal family. European monarchies, many of which had faced their own scandals and controversies over the years, observed with particular interest how the British crown was handling the balance between accountability and family loyalty. Queen Margrethe II of Denmark reportedly expressed private support for Queen Elizabeth's handling of the situation during a confidential diplomatic communication. Sometimes the institution must be protected from individuals, even when those individuals are beloved family members, the Danish monarch allegedly stated in a message that was later described by diplomatic sources. The media coverage of Prince Andrew's ongoing isolation continued to dominate royal reporting throughout the spring and summer months following the Windsor incident. Every cancelled engagement, every modified protocol, and every adjustment to his official status became newsworthy of international attention. The BBC commissioned a documentary examining the broader implications of the Andrew controversy for the future of the British monarchy. The program, titled A House Divided the Royal Family After Andrew, featured interviews with constitutional experts, former palace staff, and royal biographers who provided context for understanding the historic nature of recent events. What we're witnessing is nothing less than the modernization of royal accountability, explained Dr. Anna Whitelock during her interview for the documentary. The monarchy is demonstrating that it can adapt to contemporary expectations about consequences and responsibility, even when doing so requires painful personal sacrifices. Public opinion polling conducted throughout this period revealed complex attitudes toward both Prince Andrew and the royal family's handling of his situation. While majorities consistently supported the decision to exclude him from official events, there was also significant sympathy for the personal pain he was experiencing as a result of his institutional rejection. A comprehensive survey conducted by YouGov in June found that 67% of respondents approved of the palace's decision to distance itself from Prince Andrew, while 23% felt the punishment was excessive. Perhaps more significantly, 71% of those surveyed expressed increased respect for Queen Elizabeth's leadership during the crisis, suggesting that decisive action had actually strengthened public confidence in the monarchy. The financial implications of Prince Andrew's reduced status also became apparent during this period. His official allowance from the sovereign grant was significantly reduced, and several charitable organizations with which he had been associated quietly ended their relationships with the prince. The economic consequences of scandal proved as devastating as the social and institutional isolation. The Royal Lodge itself became a symbol of Andrew's changed circumstances. The property, which required substantial annual maintenance costs, represented a financial burden that became increasingly difficult to justify, given his diminished role within the royal family. Speculation about his eventual relocation to more modest accommodations became a regular feature of tabloid coverage. Despite these challenges, Prince Andrew made several attempts to rehabilitate his reputation and restore his position within the family hierarchy. He commissioned a team of public relations experts to develop strategies for addressing the ongoing controversy. But their efforts were hampered by the comprehensive nature of his institutional exclusion. One particularly ambitious rehabilitation attempt involved a proposed television interview designed to provide more satisfactory answers to questions about his association with Jeffrey Epstein. However, senior palace officials vetoed the project. recognizing that any further media appearances carried significant risks of generating additional controversy rather than resolving existing problems. The prince's isolation was perhaps most poignantly illustrated during the Queen's official birthday celebrations in June. For the first time in decades, he was not included in the Trooping the Color ceremony, one of the monarchy's most important annual events. His absence from the balcony appearance at Buckingham Palace provided a stark visual reminder of his changed status within the family hierarchy. Television coverage of the ceremony included frequent references to Andrew's absence, with royal correspondents explaining to viewers around the world why one of the Queen's children was missing from such a significant family gathering. The coverage served as a powerful reminder that his exclusion was ongoing and comprehensive rather than limited to specific events. As autumn approached, Prince Andrew began to contemplate the possibility that his exclusion from royal life might be permanent, rather than temporary. The institutional mechanisms that had once protected and supported him had been systematically dismantled, leaving him without the traditional avenues for rehabilitation that had historically been available to royal family members who faced scandal or controversy. His legal challenges continued to evolve throughout this period, with settlements and negotiations that further complicated his relationship with both the media and the public. Each development in his legal situation generated renewed attention to his excluded status and speculation about whether any resolution of legal matters might lead to his eventual rehabilitation within the royal family. The broader royal family adapted to Andrew's absence with characteristic resilience and professionalism. Other family members stepped up to fulfill additional responsibilities, ensuring that the monarchy's official functions continued without disruption despite the loss of one of its previously active members. Prince Edward, Andrew's younger brother, found himself taking on additional patronages and responsibilities as the family redistributed duties that had previously been handled by the excluded prince. The transition was managed smoothly, demonstrating the institution's ability to adapt to changed circumstances while maintaining its essential functions. As the first anniversary of the Windsor Horse Show incident approached, royal watchers and constitutional experts began assessing the long-term impact of Prince Andrew's exclusion on the monarchy's evolution. The precedent established by his case had created new expectations about accountability and consequences that would influence how future controversies were handled. The transformation of Prince Andrew from working royal to excluded family member represented more than just one individual's fall from grace. It marked a fundamental shift in how the British monarchy balanced personal loyalty against institutional integrity, establishing new precedents that would influence royal protocol for generations to come. The story that began with a guard's simple statement that your name is not on the list had evolved into a comprehensive examination of power, privilege, accountability, and change within one of the world's oldest surviving monarchies. The reverberations of that single moment at Windsor continued to shape not only Prince Andrew's future, but the entire royal family's approach to managing the complex relationship between personal conduct and public responsibility in the modern age.